Welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast, addressing all aspects of the digital enterprise, inspiring connection without boundaries and creation without limits. Thank you for tuning in. Here are your hosts, Tom Singer and Craig Brown.
This is the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Thank you so much for coming along on the journey of this show that we started several years ago as the resource for those who work in and around PLM. I know you have a lot of choices when it comes to podcasts, and we are glad that you're here because the Digital Enterprise Society is a forum for the exchange of ideas around the tools, processes, and practices used across the product lifecycle. To learn more, visit digitalenterprisesociety.org. My name is Tom Singer, and I have the honor to co-host this show every week with Craig Brown. Craig is an industry veteran and former PLM leader at General Motors. And this week, Craig is joined by Mark Pendergast, who is the trustee for content at the Digital Enterprise Society, and he has decades of experience working in PLM. And today, they're going to battle it out. They're going to talk about, can you build culture in your company, or must you live with the culture that you have? So, each week, we try to bring you interesting ideas and concepts and conversations that are going to help you with your career. And today, we're going to talk all about the culture that you have in your company. So, Craig, let's start with you. Do you think you can build culture, or is a company stuck with the culture they have?
You absolutely can build culture. And in fact, it's essential to stay competitive.
All right. And Mark, what's your take on this?
Well, I side with Peter Drucker, who usually knows what he's talking about in business, and he's saying it's very, very difficult to build a new culture, so you might as well just use the one you got and adapt it to the problem at hand.
All right. Well, like all of these, I'm interested to hear what each of you are going to have to say. So my first question for you is, what sustains and drives culture? So Mark, let's start with you.
Okay. Well, I think culture is your stories. It's your mythology of your company. And it's what people talk about around the water cooler or IM to each other in a meeting. It's kind of the secret sauce for the company distilled down into some kind of groupthink where everybody just kind of knows the path to success and they just follow it. And I think it's also supported by what management pays attention to and what the reward system rewards. And all those things together are really what keeps a culture moving. And it's because it's this distributed thing that's not really anywhere in particular, it makes it very difficult to change.
And Craig, what do you think?
Well, I agree with the definition, and it's really hard to disagree with Mr. Drucker. So I won't. However, what happens when you install a bureaucracy that encourages and fosters your culture? Typically, you'll do that for competitive reasons. And that's all fine and good, except when you're no longer competitive. So what do I mean by that? Well, many industries, and you can look at the Wall Street Journal, the top 100 Dow companies, and you'll notice that there's only maybe one or two that are still there after 50 years. And part of what that is culture that didn't change. And so when I point out that you have to change it, it's all a part about staying competitive. So yes, it's hard to change, no doubt, but there are techniques to make it change. And that's part of what you got to figure out if you want to stay successful. By the way, I think PLM and digitalization, so more than just moving to digital tools, I think that's part of how you can change the culture. You can become more about innovation and less about bureaucracy. And I don't think bureaucracy is bad. I just think bureaucracy, want to change because it's really good at what it does. That's how it got to be bureaucracy. So I think you have to change. You have to embrace change. But how do you do it and maintain quality? And that matters because if you don't, then you won't stay competitive. Somebody's going to beat you. That's for sure.
So is this idea of culture, is it 100% all in or no culture, or are there subcultures that exist within a company? Could one department have a different culture than the whole company? Could a subset of a department have a culture? Craig?
Well, there absolutely can be parallel cultures, and it's really easy to foster that, easier than you might think, if they're physically separate. So as we've worked for global companies, you could see this happen. You could see pockets of people in one place in the world be really, really innovative. And in fact, you might design your company that way for some new technology or some new startup venture within your company. You might purposely separate them so that it can develop its own culture. And then if that culture really does knock it out of the park, well, then you want to foster that culture in the bigger company, which is a second step. So you absolutely can have subcultures. And in fact, I think that's one of the keys to changing your culture is fostering that. Now, it creates all kinds of tension, and that's one of the downsides. And so management has to be wary of the tension that's going to get created, because the other side is going to say, well, why don't they have to follow the rules and the bureaucracy like I do? Right. And so there's you got to be careful how you manage it. But, Mark and I and you, we've talked about the hype curve at times where things are late in the cycle. You can create a new subculture early of a new technology. The bureaucracy excel at the later part of the hype curve, right? And that's how you get really good at it. And so it shouldn't surprise you that at the different places in the hype curve, you have different kinds of culture. And I think that's a clue to how you go build a subculture.
So, Mark, what is your thought? Do you think that, culture is all or nothing, or are these side-by-side subcultures going on? And is that good or bad?
Well, I think what you feel in a company, you have an overall culture and an overriding, this is kind of who we are. But I think just by the nature of people and the nature of their leaders, you'll find that different groups behave different ways. And certainly I've seen this functionally. You will find people in operations with an operations culture that finance couldn't understand if they had to. And, finance people are very controlled usually. They want all the numbers to add up, whatever. Operations people jump in the fire, right? When you talk about, they run towards the chaos, that's the lesson I learned when I was in operations. But when I moved into industrial engineering in a central role, it was very, very different culture. It was more methodical engineering. I've seen engineers in an old product line that are just kind of keeping the cash cow going that have a very different culture than people that are on a brand new product line where they really don't even know how they're going to meet all their targets. And so I think, as Craig mentioned, you want to play these cultures off against each other to get the best result. And I think that's really where you see leadership as opposed to management making a big difference. Managers can't change culture. They just live with it. And that's why a lot of people say you just got to live with your culture, because there's more managers than there's leaders. Leaders kind of inherently see that culture and find out what's going on with it. And they find the little subcultures, and make those people successful. I know in my project, when I did my huge PLM deployment, I built a microculture on my team. We were the can do, cannot fail, we're going to have it out the door no matter what culture. And that was very different than the broader IT organization I came from. But I was able to do that because we had a big enough team they couldn't find anywhere to put us. So they put us out in a manufacturing area where nobody wanted the space. And I was able to create my own little culture. And it was amazing what we were able to do because I was insulated from the broader culture. And we were actually the evangelists going out, making people take risks, making people push things forward who might not have, because we were so firm in our belief of our culture that we weren't afraid to go out and push other people around.
So, Mark, I find it interesting that you say that, your side of the battle is that you kind of have to live with what you got. But then you tell an interesting story about living with what you got while creating your own culture for your team. Can you just elaborate a little more on that?
Okay, well, we came out of an IT organization that was very by the rules, kind of finance oriented, whatever. And I actually had majority of my team was contractors who had a contractor culture. And I was able to blend them together by setting very, very clear goals and really building a family. I mean, that's something that people say, but they don't really know what it means. But every team meeting that we had, every week we got together and I started the meeting by going around the table and asking people how their personal life was. And it was amazing because all of a sudden everybody knew what everybody else was doing and they kind of, we became a family. We congratulated each other's on kids' achievements or whatever was happening. And it was really, when it came to crunch time, then those relationships stood up against the pressure. And when we went out to other groups that were picking on us and saying, hey, you're stupid, you guys don't know what you're doing, we rallied, we circled the wagons. And so my microculture could get inserted into this culture I couldn't change, and not necessarily change their culture, but kind of move them where I needed to go anyway, because we had so much energy.
Greg, you were going to say something there.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to emphasize this notion of making it more like a team or a family. That is a good leadership principle, a good leadership practice. And some people really get it. Some of the best leaders, a lot of them don't. I can remember in global meetings, one of the techniques we would use is just making sure everybody had a voice. And that just meant we simply had a structure to a meeting where you got a chance to say something at some point in the meeting, and you knew it would always happen. And so there was trust being built, even though we come from very different backgrounds, very different dialects even. It was one way we got the teams to work together on a new way of doing business around the world. So this notion of, well, this is the corporation we work for, and these are the rules, but here's what we're doing on this project, and here are some adjustments to the rules. I think that's a really good way to help encourage a culture change. One caution, though, you just really can never screw up quality, at least in mass production companies. You'll be given some free rein, especially if you've got a track record, to try some new things. But at the end of the day, you can't impact the cash coming into the company. If you do, all bets are off. This is one thing that just bothers me to no end about everybody who says, oh, well, just go get the Silicon Valley culture and keep failing until you figure out one that works. If you fail enough in mass production, and oh, by the way, all you electric vehicle startups, you'll figure it out. If you fail too much, you're not going to get the market share. And I think that's one thing that culture has to focus on as well. Is there's a reason we've been around 100 years. That reasons can't be compromised. I'm talking about from the consumer's point of view. And so as you try out these new subcultures, you still got to have a notion of what does it mean to be high quality? And people talk about process sometimes in the context of culture. Well, culture will always trump process. That's true. As much as I think process can change the way you do things, if you don't embrace changing the culture, then it won't change. So it can be done. It needs to be done with leadership. And maybe we need more leadership classes and less MBA classes, but we've had that discussion in the past. We got to measure effective leadership, not just meeting the financial goal of the next quarter.
So you guys both have brought up a couple of times this difference between managers and leaders. And I think we know both from business and from government that real good leaders are probably fewer and farther between than we'd like. But if we're dealing with a lack of leaders who can really drive this type of culture change, what are some of the methods other than like sending out a memo saying, hey, we're all changing, changing, get in line? What can people do if they're not this massive leader, but they're in a management role? What can they do to have an impact on culture change?
Throw away the memo. If they wrote the memo, it isn't going to work. People don't follow just because you're the guy with the title manager in your name. In fact, people will figure out how to work around a manager if the manager's just not inspiring or somebody they enjoy being with. That's just human nature, by the way. A lot of people talk about, walk the talk. And what they mean by that is the leader needs to exhibit the culture that he expects or she expects the people to follow. And then remind them, this is the culture we are here. So Mark's example that he used where he's asking about how they're getting along in life, how are the challenges, and then each other having each other's back. Well, I think that's a really good thing. That isn't done in a memo. That's done by a leader walking around and expressing interest and listening carefully. I mean, the one skill that just bugs me to no end with senior leaders and managers is if they have poor listening skills. The ability to listen and then lead with what you learn from the listening is really, really important. And by the way, you can change culture if you've got that skill. And I don't know why so many people don't have it, other than maybe we just need to practice it more. We all talk too much, including us on this podcast, but it really matters that you listen, right? And that you comprehend what's going on, not only in the team members, but also in the broader context of your company. Why are we encouraging a subculture? We should be able to answer that, and you should be able to answer it succinctly.
Mark, your thoughts?
Well, I think if you're going to start out to change your culture, you have to understand it is a huge mountain to move. It is essentially the secret sauce of your company. And if you try and change that, the average person is going to say, well, why are we going here? And I think, as I said in the beginning, culture is your stories. It's your mythology. So you have to change your stories. And it's not just the stories you tell, it's the stories that get told around the water cooler. It's Joe got blown up because he did this, and that's bad, and we don't do that around here. Or Harry got that promotion because he was doing this, and that's what we value around here. Those are the stories you need to change. Well, you can't change those stories unless you change who you're promoting and you change who's getting in trouble. And I think one of the things I did, again, on that same team was I changed what we celebrated. And a lot of times projects celebrate getting done or hitting dates. I didn't. I celebrated us doing little things that were important, of people reaching out and going above and beyond, helping other members of the team or things like that. And so I made my own culture by celebrating different things. I made my own culture by telling stories that I thought were important. I was a big management by walking around guy. And every day I'd pick somebody's desk and I'd plunk down and we'd talk for half an hour. And I just say, how's it going? What are you doing? Do you need help? Hey, Joe Blow over here's doing something similar. Here's what he's doing. It's kind of working. And just by telling different stories, getting that vibe going, I was able to build my microculture. And in fact, in my career with PLM, I've been able to do that on a bigger scale. I call it almost idea farming, right? You just plant the seeds, and sometimes they sprout and sometimes they don't. And when they sprout, you water them and you try and nurture them and have them take over. And it's really very, very difficult because, again, most people are managers and they don't want to hear it. So you have to be very opportunistic and you have to be very supportive of places where your culture is catching on or where it started from in the first place.
So what are your...
Mark,
go ahead.
I liked your analogy. What you really are is a culture gardener. You just got to foster the growth, right? And it's really true. It's very much like gardening. You've got to do weeding, take out the stuff that's not the culture you want. And then you got to fertilize probably. And for sure you got to water if it's a dry climate. And so figuring out these things is building a culture. Building a culture is like growing your own vegetables. It's a skill you need to develop. It's not something that just happens by magic.
So what do you guys think about either departments or companies then who bring in sort of outside coaches or training for people around their culture? And I bring this up because during the pandemic, I got certified as a trainer for an organization called the Trust Edge Institute. And it's all about building better trust within teams and then outside of your company. And I've been working with several companies kind of on long-term projects. And some companies embrace this idea of having an outside consultant and everyone is on board. And others, I get some pushback from either the leadership or the participants. What do you think of that, outside people coming in to help you shift culture?
Well, I think it's a crutch for people who aren't leaders. And I've rarely seen it work well. It usually ends up being, come in, yeah, I'll listen to this, yeah, I'll pass the test, yeah, I'll bob my head up and down, and then it's back to the old culture when he's gone. Because the leadership, the management can't sustain it. Remember, we talked about sustaining culture. When you come in as a consultant, you're not, unless you're really amazing, you're not getting to the water cooler conversations. You're not getting to the fact that Joe got fired because he screwed up X, or Harry got promoted, or Sue got this plush job. You can talk about culture, you can increase awareness, but actually making a difference, I think, is very, very difficult to do in the long run.
Tom, I'd like to share with you a little tidbit I got once. We do this a lot in my past, where we would hire somebody with some special skill, like program management skill, or how to bring in a new kind of tool into our engineering enterprise, where we have all this history about quality we've already talked about. And the gentleman's comment, and he asked me, he said, well, who did we bring in to help? And I gave him a little rundown on this third-party company. He said, oh, yeah, exactly. That way we have somebody to blame. And so there is this attitude in the middle ranks, maybe even frontline executives, that when they bring in, and it's the skeptical we now, right? When they bring in the outside consultant, they're not serious. If they were serious, the leadership would be teaching the class. And in my experience, the culture change. In my experience, that's absolutely true. At least in large companies, if the leadership isn't willing to teach it, they aren't serious about changing the culture. So that may be part of what you're running up against is the inertia of a company, right? Wherever it is in its journey, it doesn't trust management that brings in outside gunslingers. In fact, they think their gunslingers are going to shoot somebody, right?
I will tell you my findings are the ones where the management gets involved, roll up their sleeves and sit side by side with everybody in the training tend to do better when the managers say, all right, have fun and leave the room for the day. So I think there's something to be said. Even if they can't teach the class, are they sitting side by side with everybody does seem to move the needle a little bit more, because then nobody is surprised that everybody heard the same message. Right.
And we had a big initiative where I worked for a while in one of the divisions of GM around design for Six Sigma. And there's some really hard things you got to get through. And I mean, it'll stretch your engineering skills. And I got to the point, I had the methods group, and I got to the point where my black belt in my group, who did part of the training, we sat down with the senior leadership and we asked them, are you serious? And the point we were making was, if you're serious about design for Six Sigma, why haven't you been through the class yet? Right. And yeah, it's a 2-week boot camp kind of a thing. And we committed our division to doing this. And yet here you are, the senior leadership, and you don't have time for it. And there's good reasons for not having time. But at the end of the day, that lack of leadership led to a disbelief. Well, fortunately, a couple of the executives got it. And they're really bright guys. And they're now retired. They're a little older than I am. And they said, he's right. If we want to make a change here, we've got to walk the talk. And goodness, if you try a new culture that requires a skill that you just can't master, but you're on top, you're the leadership, the best thing you can do, step aside. Just move on. And that's not human nature, right? People build trust networks, and they build cliques, right? And when somebody in the clique can't make it because there's a new standard, cliques tend to defend that person, right? And so that's why it's so hard to change. When maybe you shouldn't set a culture to go in that direction, but if you're absolutely convinced you need to, well, then you've got to walk the talk, right? Well, you just have to.
Craig, the worst one is the manager who doesn't go to the class, and then somebody does what the class told him to do, and he blows them up.
Yeah,
that's my favorite.
Yeah.
Yep.
That used to be the
messengers. It isn't any good, right?
That's a thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that was actually everybody. Every time I went through one of those classes, we were all looking at each other, saying, "Okay, well, who's going to be the one that gets blown up by trying this stuff?" Because we knew they weren't committed to it, and then we knew whoever tried it first would get blown up.
All right. So why are people so resistant to culture change, both at the top, at the middle, and all the way up and down the org chart? Why are people resistant? Mark?
They don't want to get shot. Right. Mark just said it. I mean, they'd like the credit if they can get some rewards, but at the same time, it's uncomfortable. And, it's a rare individual that really wants to change all the time, and especially a culture change, because it's hard, right? There'll be some people that won't like you. There'll be some people that are scared, right? Craig, why are you changing this stuff? We work just fine the other way. Well, except we're not going to build those things anymore. We're going to build something completely different now, and we need to learn the skills of the new thing, right? And so people resist change because of probably fear. And the fear thing is the example Mark gave, where, well, the first guy that tried the new method got in trouble. He didn't get applauded. He didn't get picked up by the leader and said, "Nice try, do it again," right? Which is what you need. And so people resist culture change if they're not confident the management will or leadership will support them. And so it comes back to leadership. It really is with a big L, leadership, right? You have to be able to lead. If you can't, don't expect a cultural change.
Yeah, well, I think people don't necessarily resist change; they resist being changed. That's a saying I like to believe in. Is that people will change, but they need to do it themselves. And I think I talked about this in one of my blogs and probably in one of the podcasts I did with you guys when I first started with the Digital Enterprise Society. Is people have to be able to accept the change. I mean, culture is the secret sauce. It's how we win. And they have to believe that you can't win that way anymore, and you've got to win a new way. And they got to actually wrap their brain around that. Then the second phase is they have to accept the change, and they have to say, this is going to be good for me. I'm going to be more successful, or I'm going to enjoy my job more, or whatever. And it's hard to look at some of these changes and say, I see myself doing this a year from now and being successful. And unless you can paint that story, that new story that shows them being very successful, then you can't get them to go because they want to be successful and they're very successful doing what they're doing. And there's a performance anxiety that in the new system, I won't be as good as I am right now. And I think you need to have a person-centric view for everybody that's involved. And you also have to deal with the fact there will be winners and losers. People will do better and people will do worse. And I've always tried to be transparent about that and say, we're going on a journey because we have to. This is how we are going to get there. And here's how each of you is going to fit in. And I'm making a personal commitment. I'm going to try and make you successful in the new system by hook or crook. And again, if you've built up that goodwill with your team, they might believe you and try it. I remember several times on the PLM project, I just had to say, I've been doing this for 25 years. I know exactly where this is going. I need you guys to do this. And I know it makes no sense at all, but trust me, when we get there, it'll work out. And they had that leap of faith. And I tell you what, there's nothing on building that trust than being right. Or when you're wrong, I would always protect my people. I'd take the lumps. And they were looking at me like, who is this guy? I mean, what's he thinking? But they appreciated it.
So, I have one other thing that after 40 years of working for a long time, for many different companies, maybe this would help everybody who's listening. How often does culture change? In the successful enterprises I've been a part of, it changes every 5 to 7 years. And so if you haven't felt a change, at least in engineering companies that are innovating products, right? If you haven't felt a change in 5 to 7 years, a culture change, you're getting mature, which is good for quality, but you're going to become irrelevant. Somebody else is going to show up. And so, the car business has all of their examples. I just want to encourage people, if you are one of those folks that resists culture change for the reasons Mark and I have talked about, in reality, the long-term companies figure out how to re-innovate and change their cultures when necessary every 5 to 7 years. It's kind of interesting to watch. It might be in the cycle of the CEO, right? And so you want to watch what the leader on the top says and what they're trying to do. And the more they lead by example, as opposed to mandate, the more you probably want to work for that company. So part of my story to everybody is, well, there's places that are very comfortable with culture change. Maybe it's worth working for one of them as opposed to working in an environment where the wrong people get rewarded in the wrong way as you're trying to change the culture.
All right, so this wraps us up on can you build culture or must you live with what you got? And it sounds like the battle wasn't all that different. You got to live with what you got is what Mark said, but at the same time, you gave us some really good examples how you could change it. Craig kind of went in going, change, it's going to change anyway. So for each of you, what's your last thought around culture? Mark, we'll let you go first.
Okay, well, culture is very, very hard to change. And part of that is just because of the nature of how managers work and how people are set up. And many times culture change comes at the 11th hour when you're already in trouble and you don't have time to do it right. And I think I agree with Craig. You know, you need a long runway on culture change because it is so hard to change. And if you take the time and you do it right, you can change it. But I see most companies just don't have the time, don't do it right, and they're stuck with what they got, and they're better off just kind of adapting. Okay, what do we value? How do I tweak it a little bit to get it to move in the right direction, rather than trying to do a ground up redo of their culture?
And Craig, last word.
If you aren't willing to change your culture, you will eventually go out of business. And you just got to look at the companies that have come and gone on the Dow Jones Industrial Average and ask yourself, why is that? And usually it's a case of the culture wouldn't give in, right? That for whatever reasons, it wouldn't change. And so that's my counterpoint is you got to be willing to change. We've given you some hints on how to find that, right? If you're at a place that refuses to change, then I ask you to look at the metrics of your company, and are they dwindling? Are they getting less and less year over year? Be that profit, be it time to market, whatever. And if you see that happening, it's time to examine, well, how much longer are you going to work and where do you want to work, right? Because I think there are many, many places that are quite innovative and frankly, changing the culture intelligently is valued. So you just got to find that place.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you both for being here for another digital battle. And to everybody who tuned in and listened, join us here every single week for more thoughts, ideas, and actionable information in and around product lifecycle management. The Digital Enterprise Society is the place for the exchange of ideas around digital manufacturing tools. Go check us out at digitalenterprisesociety.org.
You've been listening to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Learn more about what you've heard here today at digitalenterprisesociety.org. Join us again next week for more connection without boundaries and creation without limits.